So the next kind of question looks at the supply side and says, with climate change, can mountains deliver enough water, right? So that's a key question that's not just significant in Sikkim, it's significant for India, it's significant for the region, and for the globe as well. By the way, that image is of the Himalayan region, the mountains up, coming up in the front, and then the Tibetan plateaus sloping down. So it's quite a striking image of what we call the third pole. That holds third pole because it holds, after the Arctic and Antarctic, it holds more ice than and snow than any place on Earth. So there are a lot of impacts on climate change, and I'll just say there are a lot of water impacts. And I'm going to let my colleague, Dr. Klavya Sharma, who many of you know, talk more about climate change impacts in this region. I'd like to talk a little bit, though, about the cryosphere, the snow and ice in this region. So if we look at the Himalayan region, the blue are the glaciers, the dark is the boundaries of the Hindu Kush Himalayan, or the regions that ICIMOD works in. What's striking is there are 10 major river basins coming off these mountains, starting, say, Amudarya, the Indus, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, Yellow, Tarim, etc. These are hugely important for food, for energy, for the globe, basically. And so the question is, and 1.2 billion people are dependent on water coming off these mountains. What's going to happen? And the first part is that in the mountain areas, what we see is that the rate of temperature increase occurs faster at higher elevations. So on the plains, people are experiencing temperature increases, but people in the mountains are experiencing a lot faster increase. What that means is, would tend to mean is glaciers and snow would tend to melt faster. And that's what we see in the mountain areas. This is Imja Glacier, 1956 photo. This is below Mount Everest, and then a 2006 photo where that glacier has just turned into a glacial lake. And this happens again and again and again across the Himalayan region. And this study was kind of looking at all the different studies. By the way, there are 56,000 glaciers in the region, and that's just a handful of studies. But on the left side of that middle line, it says glaciers are shrinking. Then on the right side, it says glaciers are growing. But in almost every case, the glaciers in the Himalayan region are shrinking, except in the big anomaly, the big exception is the Karakoram region in Pakistan. Besides impacting how much water, it says there's a big hazard waiting with the glacial lake outburst floods. And have been recorded in 56 block events in the various countries, and more just waiting to happen as climate change happens. But then let's go back and consider that question. What's the importance of glacier melt? What happens is in the rivers on the east side, say the Indus and the Amudarya, where it's dry, the rivers are highly dependent on glacier and snowmelt. The rivers on the west side of the Himalayas, rainfall becomes more important in the amount of water. That's one side of the picture. So I would say for us, living here where we are now, the glaciers are not going to make a big difference on river flow, the glacier melt. Rather, any changes in rainfall would make them better. But the second part of this picture, what it's showing us is the rivers as they're descending from the mountains. The red says how much of the river contribution is from glacier melt. And up closer to the source of the glaciers, rivers are more dependent on glacier and snow melt. As they go down, they tend to pick up more rainfall. That has significance for mountain people living right up close to the source of glaciers, because they're the ones ones who will feel the brunt of this glacier snowmelt in the mountains. Now I want to move to another topic, and that's the topic of black carbon. And black carbon, and those photos are sources of black carbon, basically the incomplete combustion of biomass that leaves that black soot in the air, say from diesel fumes, from burning, agriculture burning, or brick kilns. What happens is that that black carbon goes in the air, mixes with dust and other pollution, and forms a big cloud over the whole region, and has many different impacts. One of the impacts is that it actually causes snow and glaciers to melt faster, and it actually causes temperatures to rise faster. So this is quite striking. It is something that we can do about it, right? It's not like the other climate change story where people in the whole world are adding carbon to the atmosphere, but this is a regional issue. The benefits, if we could mitigate black carbon, are less temperature rise, reduced glacier and snow melt, as well as human health benefits, say from less pollution and less pollution either in the house or in the atmosphere. So I think this is a topic that we really do need to tackle head on, is black carbon. So if we could look at conclusions about mountains and water supply, the first thing to note is that glaciers are retreating rapidly, with some exceptions, notably the Karakoram glaciers in Pakistan. The second is that we recognize that the flow of our big rivers are dependent on glaciers, but also snow, permafrost, and rainfall. And rain on the eastern rivers is quite dominant, therefore we're more afraid of shifting monsoon patterns. On the western side, say for the Indus River, it's more dependent on glacier melt. I think that the other part there is some of the estimates of future river flow have been overestimated and caused unnecessary concern about rivers and climate change. But it still is a reason for concern. Again, dry areas are more vulnerable to glacier melt. But really what we have to watch out for is the timing and variability of water flows. In other words, the floods and droughts, especially in this region. We have to be very careful for floods and droughts. So if we look at this graphic that says, what about flood events in the greater Himalayan region? Looking at 1976, this one is up to 2004. We do see an increasing trend in the amount of flood events in the region. And this multiplied by more people living in the floodplain says this is a huge issue for us to deal with. So we've looked now at this demand for water, the supply coming off the mountains. We conclude that basically we're in a lot of trouble with our water resources, that when we look to the future, that supply is an issue. It's going to change in the future. I think that the third part is that mountains do offer solution to this global problem. So what are some of the mountain water solutions? I think the first, especially valuable for this region, is to say how to reduce vulnerabilities to floods and droughts. I think we can work together to increase our monitoring and early warning systems. We definitely have to pay much more attention to those glacial lakes. And we have to invest in water storage across the region to deal with droughts. Now, I have to point out that people, when you think of water storage, you might think of dams or water harvesting. But please recognize that water can be stored in the soil, can be stored in natural wetlands. It is stored in glaciers. We have to consider our natural systems as well as our human-built systems to deal with this. And the last point is that in order to deal with floods, they cross boundaries. They don't need a visa. Is that we have to work across boundaries in order to deal with the issue of water management in the mountains. The hydraulic structure there is a Sancho, a key. And what it does is the communities have developed a water rights system that says that if you own 10 hectares of land, you get this much water. If you own 5, you get this much. So the water rights are kind of ingrained right in the structure that was invented by that community. You see that several places right across the mountains. I think there is definitely scope for understanding how communities manage their water and building on that. Fourth, what I'd like to say is that mountain systems do provide plenty of ecosystem services, and we have to provide incentives for those communities to manage their water systems, to manage ecosystem services. And that also has to work across borders to happen. The fifth recommendation is that we do, in this region, have significant scientific uncertainties. We really have data gaps as far as our water, as far as climate, as far as socioeconomic data, and there's a huge role to fill in that. And again, we also need to fill a gap about what kind of information in local and indigenous system is there. And then finally, and I believe one of the concerns of this meeting itself is to put mountain issues in the national agenda. But it's more than that. It's to put mountain issues in the global agenda. Because mountains are a global resource. I hope I've been convincing that water supply from mountains is of local concern. But because of water scarcity and food security, it's also very much a global concern. And we need to tell the global community about that. The global activities, right, of just expanding population, of climate change, put a lot of pressure on mountain systems. And we need to get that attention to come back to mountain areas and mountain people, really to solve some of the big world's problems that we have today. So I want to thank you very much for your attention to the presentation.